Hello, I'm Jake Stone, and we welcome you to another episode of the Reformed Baptist Church of Louisville podcast. And it is a pleasure and honor to be joined with one of our pastors, Pastor Jim Savastio. Pastor Jim, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, Jake. Thank you. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. We're going to talk a little bit today about something I really love.
Okay.
Baptist history.
Yes, anybody who knows Jake loves Baptist history.
Well, you've already in the beginning of the podcast talked about the history of RBC, but the history of RBC is also located in a larger story, and that is kind of the history of the modern Reformed Baptist movement. Now, when we think about Reformed Baptist, we think about the guys over in England, the early American Baptist, even Southern Baptists at the beginning were Calvinistic, but as we move into the 20th century, a lot of the confessional Calvinism had been lost.
Right.
So how does RBC in Louisville get here in the sense of what's happening before 1989?
Yeah, so Jake, I'm going to give you some of the best as I understand that a part of what God began to do God began to do some things in England and through the ministry of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, and especially his input into the Banner of Truth Trust, a publishing house that began to republish Puritan works at an affordable price and to get those widely distributed. And also the Banner of Truth conferences that were held, I believe, in a place called Leicester in England, and some of the men who began to teach and preach. So there was always a strand. There's always been, just as we talked about with landmarkism, there's always this trail of Calvinism, this trail of the Reformed faith. And so there were institutions in America like Westminster Seminary, and men like John Murray and E.J. Young and Gretchen Machen and others who were teaching and preaching kind of a more classic Westminster confessionalism. In the 1950s, Calvinism began to, I think largely through some of these teachings, preachings, and the reading of old books, began to grow among Baptists. And again, I think you probably say, well, there's always been a stream of Calvinistic Baptists. Men like A.W. Pink was certainly a Calvinistic Baptist, and he pastored churches in the U.S. as well as in Scotland and in England. But he pastored for a time in South Carolina and published a magazine, a newsletter, and so there were those where the seeds of that were being planted. In the 1950s, there were men like Al Martin who began to pastor eventually what would be considered a flagship Reformed Baptist church, at least for many people, would be considered a flagship Reformed Baptist church, had been converted, been a preacher, had gone to Bible college, had embraced the doctrines of grace. And there were meetings even in Kentucky and among what were then just called Sovereign Grace Baptist churches. And so some of those began to have assemblies, began to have conferences, and men who held to the doctrines of grace would preach. And again, from my understanding, and I may not have all of this exactly right, but some of these men like Al Martin, men like Walt Chantry, began to discover the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith. And so it had been men, Al Martin and some others had a background in places like Bob Jones. Actually, Al Martin also then went to Columbia Bible College in Columbia, South Carolina. I think he had come to the doctrines of grace since then. Bob Jones was very uncomfortable with Calvinism. Columbia Bible College in Columbia, South Carolina, my own alma mater. So he went there, became dean of students, and then later was an itinerant evangelist, and then became a pastor, initially in the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And as he imbibed more of the doctrines of grace, as he read the confession, so some of that, again, that fundamentalism, the sovereign grace Calvinism, began to be wedded with a fuller ecclesiology. And questions about, well, what is a church, began to be hammered out. What are the offices of the church? And so matters of what are now more commonplace in Baptist life, but plurality of elders, parity of elders, the idea that elders, pastors, overseers are all the same thing, pastors and deacons being the only offices, that there are biblical qualifications and that there are biblical descriptions. Imagine that. That the Bible does describe for us what a church is, how a church is to be led, what church membership is. And so that was tied in with a solid conviction rooted both exegetically but also confessionally in the sufficiency of the scriptures to do church life. That church life had largely become a matter either of tradition or pragmatism. And one of the things that some of these brothers would say back then is that until you're willing to deal with what they called the two-headed dragon of pragmatism and traditionalism, you'll make no way toward true biblical reformation. And so some began to see themselves not just as the heirs of this branch of the Reform movement, which some would, and I think you've spoken about this, Jake, in a recent Sunday school class, which you can listen to through sermon audio, if you like, about that Baptists were more thorough reformers.
Yes.
And so getting back to what was historically reform, but also becoming modern day reformers, and saying that we want to now reform, I sometimes use the word conform the church to what we see in our Bibles and what our ecclesiastical heroes have done in the past, and to bring what they have said and what they've done into modern church life.
So in thinking about these early days with Pastor Martin and in the 1960s, and you may not know the answer to this question, but I'm wondering, as Banner is developing and is republishing works, what role does someone like C.H. Spurgeon have in these early days? Because here's a man that is himself, when he came to London, he republishes the Confession, which was kind of an anomaly for that period actually in England. And so what role did Spurgeon have?
Spurgeon also has a copy of the Confession of Faith laid in the cornerstone of the Metropolitan Tabernacle. So, I mean, a huge role. I've said sometimes a little bit tongue-in-cheek, Spurgeon is our trump card, if you are, if anybody's in an argument, say, well, Spurgeon said or Spurgeon did. He's as close to a patron saint among the Reformed Baptists as you get. But certainly, I mean, Spurgeon had an effect upon even the fundamentalists, the sword and trowel and the sword of the Lord, even, with fundamentalist guys, anti-Calvinistic guys. And some of these guys are shocked when you tell them that Spurgeon was actually a 5-point Calvinist. That was like, no, he's not. And then it's like, well, he actually says that he is. And here's sermons on each of the points of the doctrines of grace in which he held to those things. So that was a great encouragement to find men like Spurgeon. And more recently in their history, it wasn't that long before that, men like A.W. Pink. But then you get some of these men that were, the Sovereign Grace Baptist men like Henry Mahan and some others, and then you had the Reformed and the Confessional group, and they were divided over particularly matters relating to the law of God, the moral law of God, and the perpetuity of the fourth commandment were big dividing things, and so accusations of legalism, antinomianism, etc. went on. And so while there was a commonality agreement on the doctrines of grace, there was not a common confessionalism. But one of the things, so Al Martin was, he's still alive as of recording, was a very gifted preacher. And so at this time, they were using, in the early days, reel-to-reel tapes. But then particularly when cassettes became available, his teaching and preaching began to spread. And people were coming to the doctrines of grace. People were embracing this kind of, not just consecutive expository preaching, but real preaching to the conscience, as well as a carefully laid out vision of ecclesiology and worship that still is in effect, and many have been affected by it today, because we can read about these things, but when you see them and somebody says, let me show you how I put this into practice, that can be very powerful. And that footprint is still seen in many churches, although I think some are beginning to feel a little bit of freedom to say that within the bounds of what we call the regulative principle of worship, that God determines how he will be worshiped. You can work some of those things out a bit differently. But it was that ministry, and then Al Martin began to preach. They began to invite him to preach at the Banner of Truth conference. And one of the men that was very impactful in seeing that done was a man named John Murray, who was a professor of systematic theology at Westminster Seminary, a one-eyed Scotsman who was a very gifted theologian. Some would be knowledgeable of books like Principles of Conduct, about biblical ethics. In some of those. Redemption accomplished and applied. Right. I had 8 different words going through my head there at one time. Redemption accomplished and applied. There's a 4-volume set of published by the Banner of Truth. Part of that is a biography, and one of those biographies deals with his embrace of the Reformed Baptist and the desire to promote men like Al Martin and to see Baptists being brought into the Banner of Truth life, which had been largely Presbyterian, although Martin Lloyd-Jones was not a Presbyterian. Right. Martin Lloyd-Jones, actually, I didn't know this until a few years ago, actually held to believer baptism by immersion. So that was a good win to get that on our side. So then you began to see churches spring up, and there would be this commonality. So there was Al Martin there in Montville, New Jersey. There was a man named Walt Chantry in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. 2 very strong personalities, strong leaders, and then you had others. So it tended to be a East Coast, West Coast. So you had churches in California that were kind of following some of this same model, but then men that I began to know, so that by the men who in the early 70s were planting churches, young men, Gary Hendricks in Mebane, North Carolina, Randy Pizzino in Roanoke, Virginia, Jim Huffstetler and Sam Waldron in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and people began to attend these churches, and they began to network, get to know each other, share pulpit, share prayer letters. And that was kind of, as I entered into this in the 80s, and my first real understanding and hearing of these were somewhere around the mid-'80s, and where I began to hear not just the doctrines of grace, but Reformed Baptist, and then hear about the confession of faith. And that came about through my own pastor, who had been influenced by some of these men who by that time, again, were networking. They were producing material, little bits. Banner of Truth was publishing certain sermons by Pastor Martin. The cassette tape ministry was becoming widely used. And again, there was a style. Again, Pastor Martin has a way of preaching that very few have. It's just a very powerful and direct way. In today's setting, I don't know if it would go down quite the way that it did back then, but many continue to be helped, and thousands can still listen and do listen on sermon audio to older Al Martin sermons. And when he's come and preached here a few times, those are some of our most downloaded sermons. But my own pastor, George McDearman, had come to the doctrines of grace somewhere around 1980, 1981 through preaching through the book of Ephesians, and was content originally simply to say that we are Calvinists. But he went to a conference, a Southern Baptist conference, and there was a man there who had a table, and he was passing out Banner of Truth books and Trinity pulpit tapes, in which they heard Al Martin. And what he and another man, a man named Dean Allen, who was pastoring a church in Albany, New York, Southern Baptist church plants, what they heard just kind of blew their mind, and they began to recognize and realize that not only do we need to have a passion to see the glory of God in salvation, which the doctrines of grace really promote, but they had a zeal to see the glory of God in the life of the church. That in ecclesiology, how does the knowledge of these things affect how we do church? What the church is, how the church is led, how the church worships, what are the responsibilities and duties of church members. And that's where the real division kind of was between the sovereign grace Calvinistic movement and even some who were content, I say in a sense, content with mere Calvinism in their churches, but you never really saw it worked out in the life of the church. And I think the distinction of men that I would call Reformed Baptists, and my definition of Reformed Baptist is somebody who holds in theology and practice to those truths laid out in our confession of faith. Again, some people would quibble with that, but I would say if you don't hold to the 1689, you're a Calvinistic Baptist, you're not really a Reformed Baptist, or you may be a sovereign grace Baptist. Nobody copyrighted it, so I'm not able to say. But in my mind, I'm able to have people tell me I'm a Reformed Baptist, and I don't say, no, you're not. I used to do that, like, no, you're not, or I was like, I couldn't control myself. No, you're not. If you don't hold to the confession of faith, you're not a Reformed Baptist. That's what a Reformed Baptist is, and I think that would be helpful. And there are obviously a lot of guys today who say I'm 1689, and I haven't actually read it. The fact that you have it doesn't mean you know it, and doesn't mean you live it out.
There's a lot of rabbit trails that I want to go down.
Yeah, sorry, I've talked too much here.
I want to step back for just a minute, and as this is growing here with Pastor Martin and Pastor Chantry and Banner, are they receiving any influence from men in England? I know we've talked about Martin Lloyd-Jones, but I think about Austin Walker, a man that he's not originally, if I understand correctly, from England, but Errol Hulse.
Right.
Who started Reformation Today.
Yes, Errol.
And he's, a lot of guys that are my age that have come to Reformed Baptist truths don't even know who that is, and yet he had a very impactful role in networking and connecting Reformed Baptists globally.
So Jeff Thomas in Aberystwyth, Wales, is one. There's another man, a dear friend of mine, Jack Seaton, W.J. Seaton. He wrote, there's a little banner booklet on baptism that he wrote, W.J. Seaton. Well, Wee Jack, as he's sometimes called, he was an Irishman, but he pastored in Inverness, Scotland. Now, Jack reckons he was the first church to call themselves a Reformed Baptist church, to actually use that title. And I had the privilege of preaching there some years ago.
Do you know what year that would have been?
1970.
Okay.
So, fascinatingly, 70, 71. So Jack had been asked, you'll appreciate this, Jack had been asked to be the pastor of Metropolitan Tabernacle. And Jack actually candidated there. And among the things that they gave to him in order to try to woo him was some of the memorabilia from the opening of the tabernacle. So there are plates that were made up, china plates that were made up, and he even has a bust of Spurgeon that was cast in the 1800s.
If we believed in relics, these would be relics.
Well, yes. Jack Seaton said one time, this was really cute, he said, somebody said to him, "Oh, you like Spurgeon, do you?" He said, he was a bit odd. He goes, "A bit odd." He said, if he hadn't been so odd, he said, I'd have a candle on either side of that bust, So that keeps us from worshiping him, some of his peculiarities. But so men like that. So the Metropolitan Tabernacle had been and considers itself today a confessional Reformed Baptist church. And that's a church that, before that had been New Park Street Church and has, as you know, its history going back into hundreds of years before with John Gill and Benjamin Keach and others that, you have this great tradition of teachers and preachers, some of them who then became the framers of the confession and writers of the confession. And so you have that unbroken. So, so men like Jeff Thomas, Errol Hulse. And again, some of these men are going to have some differences. Some of these men had some differences. I think Pastor Martin's style was very off-putting to some Englishmen. And so while they agreed with the theology and recognized that he was, in some ways, a powerful preacher, he was a bit off-putting by, he could be quite loud and strong in the pulpit. And he had a way. In fact, remember when I was beginning my studies at the Trinity Ministerial Academy, he gave a quotation, and I think it might have been from John Owen. He says, "You need to take the truth and screw it into a man's conscience." I can remember him talking about that in that picture of driving not a nail but a screw into somebody's conscience. And so those men in England, And then you began to find, by the time again I am coming into this, there are men in the Philippines that were there were works in Pakistan that were going on. The Confession of Faith is being in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. And then hearing about in 1988, 1989, a man named Achille Blaze, who had pastored in London, had been an elder at Trinity Baptist. He goes and does a conference in Zambia, and men like Conrad Mbewe, 20-something years old, Ronald Kalafungwa, and some others hear that, and it's a message about being confessional. And that begins to burn in them. His name was Blaze, and so they like to use that and say he lit a fire, or these things began to burn in them. And so some of the churches that are planting the most Reformed Baptist churches that I know of are actually in Zambia. But the Confession of Faith, it's just such a striking thing that African believers could take a document written in London in the 1670s originally and find it as something of a blueprint and being excited about it. In fact, a man from our church just recently taught symbolics, or the London Baptist Confession of Faith, at two ministerial colleges in Zambia that our church was blessed to help start.
And I think it's a testimony that these are the truths that we find in Scripture that we're just systematizing and putting in a confessional form, and that's why its impact is what it is.
Right. So I'm able to go to places like, Lord willing, in the year, months ahead, I'll go to Chile, Ecuador, Cuba. I was in Cuba among men who are gripped by these same truths that were written hundreds of years ago and laid down in confessions. And you realize, what is it about that? Well, because what is the confession but a rewriting of certain passages of Scripture? As was said of Bunyan long ago, you prick Bunyan and he bleeds bibline. You prick the Confession of Faith anywhere, it just pours out Scripture. It's a systemization of the Scriptures that ring true, and not only that you say this is right, but this works. You can put this into practice.
And we'll close this by talking about, you mentioned it in a previous podcast we did about Pastor McDermott and his connection with the early days of Founders. And so thinking about our context here in Louisville,
yes,
and that, for example, one of the kind of the forerunner of Founders Ministries was Ernie Reisinger,
right,
who was connected with Banner up in Pennsylvania, was moved to Florida, and they had what was called the Boyce Project, which was to reprint James Pettigrew Boyce, the first president of Southern Seminary, his systematic theology, which was a confessional Calvinistic work, and that Ernie Reisinger would go to Southern Baptist Seminary graduates and give them a copy and would tell them, read it all, but read the chapters on soteriology, and if you agree, write me.
Right, and from what I understand, so Cosmosdale, which is a church here in Louisville, in the days of its moderate liberal bent, would have a booth somewhere out and give to new students Daggs, I think, systematics and Boyce, and trying to promote the doctrines of grace among students. So one real quick story, you may appreciate this. I may not have all the story correct. I hope I don't give an apocryphal tale. So George McDearman, my pastor, is invited to speak at one of the first Founders Conferences. And he is asked to do a review of Ian Murray's The Forgotten Spurgeon.
Okay.
And part of that book is the downgrade controversy and the need and necessity of breaking away from the Baptist Union in the light of truth. Well, Pastor McDearman at the Southern Baptist Founders Conference thought that the logical application of that is that we stop being Southern Baptist and pull out in light of its doctrinal drift and form our own. That didn't go over very well. It was like, no. That's we want to stay Southern Baptist. We want to be able to do this and stay within the context. And so he eventually left the Southern Baptist. He that was kind of one of the impetuses of doing that. And he thought that was the logical. If you want to go Spurgeon, that's the logical connection, and that didn't go over very well.
Well, I hope one thing we can all appreciate is that these truths, the confession that we hold dearly, and that so many resources are so prominent now, we would not have it if it were not for these means that God used in the decades past of men that some that are known and some that are not known. And it needs to be an encouragement to us to be good stewards with what they have passed on to us.
Yeah, and to see it grow the way that it has from a few churches to churches all over the world has been exciting in my own life to be able to witness.
Well, Pastor Jim, thanks for sharing with us some of the history behind the modern Reformed Baptist movement. And join us next time for our next podcast here at RBC Louisville.